Welcome to In a Nutshell, where we explore the triumphs and follies of a vegetable, flower, or fruit through history. In medieval times, petty criminals were humiliated in the stocks, where villagers threw many varieties of rotten vegetables and eggs. This practice continued for centuries and made its way to ancient Greece, where bad performances were rewarded with, you guessed it, rotten tomatoes. Now, the popular website RottenTomatoes.com is an homage to this history, reviewing movies with a tomato rating system. In the 1940s, Spain adopted La Tomatina, a tomato fight that takes place once a year. No one is really positive what inspired the festival, but there are several interesting theories. In the United States, the tomato, fruit, or vegetable question made its way to Capitol Hill. This happened because a trade tax was placed on vegetables and not fruit. It was decided that even though botanically the tomato is a fruit, it is eaten like a vegetable and therefore a vegetable in the trade world. Nice try, big business. Recently, the tomato made its way back to Capitol Hill. Tomato trade became heated between Mexico and America. The Mexicans were selling us tomatoes at such a low cost that an anti-dumping investigation went underway. In case you aren't familiar, dumping means selling something below the cost of production. Here's where it gets interesting. Our native tomatoes are grown in the state of Florida. Now, if you know anything about tomatoes, humidity is not the best thing. It attracts pests for one, and because the tomato flourishes in a setting with controlled water intake, it complicates things as well. You can imagine the cost of pesticides, and not to mention fertilizing the sandy ground of Florida. An interview on NPR with the author of Tomatoland describes Florida's growing conditions.
First and foremost, the state is notoriously humid. And tomatoes, their ancestors, are native to extremely dry areas of the western coast of South America, desert conditions. And that's why tomatoes grow so well in Italy and parts of California. They love dry, sunny days. Florida is very humid. Perfect conditions for all manner of molds, funguses, bacteria, insects, nematodes, you name it, that prey on tomato plants. So the climate, to begin with, the climate is simply not right. The second big problem is Florida's soil. Where tomatoes are grown, and soil is probably a misnomer. Most Florida tomatoes are grown in sand. Pure and simple. It's the same sand you find on Daytona Beach.
Now for the freaky part.
I came up behind a truck. I first took it for a gravel truck. It was one of those open-back trucks. And then as I pulled closer, I realized it was full of green orbs of some sort. And again, I thought, well, they look like Granny Smith apples, and then realized, well, wait a second. Granny Smith apples don't grow in Florida. And as I came closer, it was full of tomatoes, perfectly green tomatoes. There was not a hint of pink or orange or red, just green tomatoes.
There's only two things that money can't buy, and that's true love and homegrown tomatoes.
I learned that these tomatoes are sent to a gas chamber of sorts to add the chemical that is usually naturally produced in the tomato to add the color. And if you've ever wondered why store-bought tomatoes are not as delicious as your homegrown tomatoes, it's because when the tomato is picked, that's when it stops the flavor train. If that isn't motivation enough to grow your own tomatoes, I don't know what is. Anyway, it's no wonder Mexico can produce tomatoes at lower costs. To top it off, they've recently invested millions in greenhouses to grow tomatoes for export. Thankfully, Mexico and America reached an agreement because if they hadn't, our Florida-produced tasteless tomatoes would have doubled in price, affecting all the tomato products that we love. And that's the tomato in a nutshell.
In the middle, put your homegrown tomatoes on a hot cake griddle. Homegrown tomatoes, homegrown tomatoes.